Welcome to the webinar, Retrospective and Looking Forward, a review of 2 full years of open payment data. We'll be starting in approximately 1 minute.
Yes. We'll give everyone 1 minute, last minute.
Yeah.
At the CBI conference in August, Thomas gave a full review of 2 years open payments data and media coverage, and it received a phenomenal feedback from the audience. So we thought it would be great to have Thomas present his presentation at the CBI conference in this webinar to everyone who were not part of the conference.
So welcome everyone to this webinar.
Thomas was the former political consultant who founded Rockpoint Biomedication Education Company in 1995. He's the founder of CME Coalition and co-founder in Acre. He's right now the editor of Policy in Medicine and publisher at Life Science Compliance Update. We are very delighted to have him today speak on a full 2-year review of open payment data. With that said, I would like to give the mic to Thomas. Tom, off to you.
Well, thank you very much, Safar. I appreciate everybody joining us today, and we're going to cover a little what we covered at the meeting, but we're also going to cover a lot of additional information that's been happening in open payments. And as we reviewed to prepare for this, we really saw that it's quite a fluid situation. So first, we're going to do is review the 2014-2015 data. We're going to discuss what the median open payments kind of the week of the 25th release, but also just what's come since then. We're going to look at some journal publications that have come out, some which have pretty significant, will have pretty significant impact in the future. Evaluate prosecutions using open payments. Deliberate the CMS question on open payments that they submitted out for comment, and just kind of give you guys an idea of what's happening with that. And then we'll look at global ag spend, and Safar will cover a little bit of FPIA. So let's go to the next slide. So what we've seen when you look at open payments is that, and this is a Google Trends report that we pulled, and you can see that basically there was very little traffic about open payments or Physician Payment Sunshine Act until November of 2015, and that was when John Oliver did his little special on it, and you can see it's kind of dropped back down, not quite to the same level it was before the John Oliver show, but basically it's pretty a low level topic, and I encourage you one day just to go on Google Trends and pull things like this. It's kind of a neat way to look at it. Let's go to the next 2 slides. And so now we're going to basically look at the data. So let's look at the open. When we looked at the first year, go to the next slide, please. When we looked at the first year, the open payments data, if we looked at all 3 years they reported, basically between 2014 and 2015, you look at general payments, really general payments, research payments, ownership payments, really no changes in the data. I mean, it was very, very, very stagnant as far as that goes. But as you go to the next slide, as you look, but if you consider this is a lot like a lake in that there's on the surface, it looks like everything is calm, everything is completely the same, but underneath the water there's a lot of action going on, and I think that's what's really happening with open payments. And I think so we're going to go kind of deep under. So if you can look at the next slide, you can see that physicians receive the bulk of the payments, and then everybody else just kind of dropped off the map, with one chiropractic receiving 1 payment in 2014, no payments and 5 payments in 2015. So if you haven't given to chiropractors, maybe you guys consider doing it. Let's go to the next slide. So when we looked at the open payments data, basically what we saw was that the total payments are effectively the same from 2014 to 2015, somewhere around 7.47 to 7.52 billion. The number of physicians receiving a payment is static year over year as well at 618,000. The total number of records published has also showed no growth, about 1.9 million. And average payments received by physicians, total payments of the number of physicians, no difference between 12,200 in 2014 against 12,168 in 2015. The only real change in this is actually in this data is the number of companies that report under open payments. Initially, it went up by 14%, and then last year we saw a drop of 8%. And I think some of that has to do with acquisitions. Some of that also has to do with just some movement within the industry. But it's interesting. I was yesterday out in California and with some biotech companies, and there probably is 1,400 biotech companies. So if all those bring drugs to their markets, I think we'll have. I think we'll see this list greatly expand. When we looked at the next, go to the next slide. When we looked at the payment categories, we can see that there was significant kind of changes in some of the categories, but when you think about it, the overall amounts aren't really that much. So, for instance, research grew by 3%, but things and royalties grew by 14%, which was a pretty significant, about $100 million in that category. But when we went down to charities, which went from 10 million to 23 million, it went up 126%, and even CMS even commented in their statement that this was a really good sign that we're seeing this large, but it's a really small amount of money when you consider all the funds that are being spent. Other categories that went down were speakers. Entertainment actually dropped down to 378,000, so very little money now being spent on entertainment. The gifts category has dropped pretty significantly, but with gifts, for the most part, those represent things that you just can't put in other categories. So I think with the comment period coming, with the potential changes, I think that may be able to be fixed. When we look to go to the next slide, when we looked at total payments by specialty, we saw some specialties saw a great increase and others saw a great decrease. And some of that may change actually in this next year. So rheumatology, for instance, increased 129%. Medical oncology payments to physician increased 115%, but ophthalmology dropped 55%, and internal medicine went up 67%. So you can see that some are going up and some are going down, but I think if you see, there'll be more ophthalmology may actually bounce back in the next couple of years with some new products on the market. When we looked at, go to the next slide, when we looked at research and between the differences between the research and the general payments, it was interesting. And when we looked at just the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies, there's a pretty significant variation in that places like Novartis, and from the research side, places like Novartis, AstraZeneca, GSK, and Genentech, Roche, and Pfizer all had pretty significant increases in their research, but other companies like Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline, and Gilead all had a great amount of decreases in their research spending. Some of that may be because of delays, and companies more exercising their opportunity to delay, but it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about, is that there's some movement here that may necessarily wasn't there in other years. As far as general payments, it's pretty static, with the exception you have about 20% increases. Novartis increased 20%, Sanofi increased 20%, Merck increased to 21% in their payments to physicians, and Gilead increased 14%. In Novartis' case, I think part of the reason for the increase is the swapping portfolios with GSK for vaccines and for oncology. But then there's some serious decreases in general spending. Pfizer and AstraZeneca being two of the large players that significantly decreased the amount of spend that they were spending. And we'll go to the next slide. When we looked at specialty research, again, ophthalmology was down, cardiovascular disease was up, other services, dermatology was down, dermatology was down, internal medicine was up. So go to the next slide. When we looked at research spending by state, we saw that places like Florida, North Carolina, and Illinois all had nice little increases, but states like Pennsylvania, Michigan had decreases in their research payments. So the research is moving around the country and relocating from one part to another. Go to the next slide. When we looked at research by city, anybody, I don't know why, but for some reason, states, go to the next slide, states like Portland, cities like Portland had almost a 250% increase in their research spending, and where everyone else kind of remained stable. So if you want to do apparently Portland is a nice place to go do research. It probably has nice bike trails. Might want to consider seeing why they're increasing the research spending there. Research by company. Go to the next slide, please. We can see that again. AstraZeneca basically had a 40% increase. Amgen saw a nice increase. Other companies saw decreases. Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline, and then Sullivan had a nice increase, but it's a small amount. And then Teva also had a nice increase in spending on research. Go to the next slide. When we looked at it by teaching hospital, and these are the top 10 teaching hospitals that receive research payments. You can see a significant drop in what was spent at MD Anderson, what was spent at Brigham and Women's, and what was spent at Dana-Farber. But there was a huge increase in the amount that was spent at Cleveland Clinic, Hospital, University of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts General Hospital, University of Michigan Hospital Center, all had nice increases. And so the research money is moving around as far as from institution to institution. And then we're going to now go over to general payments. Before I do that, though, I'd just like to say that some of the limitations on the research data are that not all research can be attributed to a specialty or a hospital, because so much of it is 80 to 90% of it is delayed publication. So we don't know if this. I'm not going to verify the complete accuracy of the long-term accuracy of the percentages. In the general payment category, which is required to be reported every year, go to the next slide, please. 2 more slides. I'll give it a second. 1 more. There we go. So we look at key year-on-year open payment changes in the general payments. Again, very little on the surface. Very little ratio of disputed payments was incredibly small, like basically 0.11. You almost want to ask yourself, what are we trying to fix by fixing disputes? I mean, that's almost unheard of. Disputes went down each year significantly, 14%, 41% in the first year, so 18% in the second year, and the ratio disputed to non-disputed dollar values dropped the first year, but then it raised a little bit, but that's just because of the low number of disputes. Go to the next slide, please. When you look at general payments by month, it's very much, you can see it's pretty normalized over a month. It's not, there's just some months that it just spends a little bit less, and others they spend more, a lot basically, and year over year it looks like about the same. Seems like August, May, and in December there's a little bit more spending if you look at it year over year. Let's go to the next slide. When we looked at the general payments by state, you can see that there was really no increases in general payments by state. There were some significant states that had significant decreases, for instance, Tennessee and Arizona, and I don't know if that's just because the doctors are retiring in those states or what would be the reason, but those states had significant drops. Go to the next slide, please. The general payment by company, you can see that most companies didn't have any real increases or changes in their general payments. These are the top 10 companies, but you can see that Medtronic Vascular had a huge increase in the payments they made to physicians, partially because they were launching some new products, and then NuVasive also had increases in general payment category. Go to the next slide. When we looked at general payments, companies with high differences, for instance, we pulled out just those companies with a high difference. We noticed that Ablative Solutions, for instance, had 123,000% difference, because last year they only spent 155% to $190,000, 155 to 90. What you see is basically these are companies that didn't spend any money, and now this next year is spending pretty significant amount of money. Much of that has to do with product launches. Go to the next page. And you can see from this slide that these were basically explained by, next slide please, that this was explained by FDA approvals. These are 2 different FDA approval, 2 of the ablative solutions, for instance, and others that were on this list that got FDA approvals. Go to the next slide. General payments by pharma product. we can say that basically you saw really no difference in any of the top paid pharma products year over year. But what you did see is Concentex had a 400% increase, largely due to a product launch. It gives you an idea that as you're categorizing things by product, that you will see some differences, especially around product launch year. And just note that, you know, when you if you had some consensus, you might want to just look into what they were spending their money on. Go to the next slide. We also looked at travel by city, and this is kind of a, you know, an interesting artifact in that more people now are less people now are going to Houston and Chicago. About the same went to New York. Orlando seems to be down, and San Francisco seems to be down in travel. But the big winner is Miami, a 10% increase, which isn't a huge number, but a 10% increase in travel. Las Vegas didn't change, and Atlanta had almost a 10% increase in travel, a 5% increase in travel. So, you know, some of that has to do with annual meetings, being located from one place to another. Maybe Miami this year might come down because of the Zika virus, but we'll just never know until next year. Go to the next slide, please. When we looked at faculty and speaker payments for accredited and non-accredited education programs, the top 7 companies are Novartis Pharmaceuticals, Valiant, Iroko, and then Omricorp had a huge increase in the percentage, and then ACell had an increase in Implant Direct and Tulsa Dental. What's interesting though is the price per payment goes up. So some companies spend more per payment than others when it came to speaker programs. Consulting fees, kind of the same. Everybody paid around $4,000. Not really much change, but you could see that DuPuy Orthopedics had an increase, and they also pay about $5,000 as an average payment to a consultant at that company. Go to the next slide. And some of that just could be the way they just keep their accounting. Next slide. Education payments by the top 7 companies, pretty much flat across the board, as far as there were some increases in like Coral Storts or Orthoplast or ACell had an increase this past year, but you can see their average payments at roughly anywhere from $1,900 to $766 per payment. Go to the next slide. Next slide. When you looked at entertainment, next slide, please. So there was really small amounts in entertainment in the, get me over to entertainment. There we go. You can see there's really small amounts on the entertainment side of this. You can see that all these numbers are quite small, $180, $300, $73, and some had decreases and some had increases, but by and large, there's not a lot of people. These are usually little itty-bitty companies that are doing these, they're still doing entertainment. Go to the next slide. When we looked at food and beverage, the average payment for food and beverage, you know, everybody's worried about doctors being influenced by high-priced meals. The averages range anywhere from $17, $14 to a high of $19 on the, or $21. So somewhere between $14 and $21 if you looked at the top 10 companies that spend food and beverage. So, you know, we're talking about a sandwich, you know, maybe a bag of chips, maybe some coffee. I don't know, but it's just they're pretty small numbers of payments. Go to the next slide, please. When we looked at honorariums paid by the top 7 companies, you can see that many companies are somewhere around $1,500 for honorarium payments, $1,500, with one company being about $5,000. So if you're paying honorarium, you're using that category, just note that sometimes that shows up. And then go to the next slide. And when we looked at gifts, again, this is another way. We also looked at gifts, and we saw that places like Stryker had a huge drop in their payments, but as far as the amount per payment, it's pretty low. Benco Dental pays very, very low amounts in their payments, like $4. ADECO, same thing. Orca Life though had 18,000 was their average gift payment. So I'm not sure what that means, if that's a loan of equipment or did they give someone some equipment for their office. And then Plumber Medical Systems also had about a $11,000 gifts for payments. Go to the next slide. When you look at the gifts detailed, and again, this is the same information, you can see Arcalife was like 17,000, Fujifilm was like 10,000, and then Intuitive Surgical was 8,000, and then others were down to 185 or 119. I mean, pretty low numbers on their payments. Go next slide. One of the kind of entertaining portions of the gifts is we looked at the comment sections inside some examples, and things came up as far as customer loyalty programs showed up. I know one company that does a customer loyalty program based on a credit card, a dental company that gives them points back from their credit card, and they report that as a gift. Customer appreciation events. Some companies had wrote in there that they gave chocolate coolers and TVs. One company wrote in there to giving out Christmas gifts. One company is buying jumpers. I'm not sure what the heck that is. I mean, I know it's, I know what a jumper is, but I'm not sure why anyone would give that as a gift to somebody that they weren't really close with. And then finally, one company had bottles of Maker's Mark. They put that in the comment section. I have no idea why they felt they needed to be so specific about the gift, but because that's an optional field, but that's just what they wrote in. Go to next slide, please. So if you look at disputes, these are the total number of disputes from 2013 was 911. Last year there's about a little more than 1,000 disputes on the general database, and about 18% of the number and about 120% of the total amount. I mean, these are really percent of payments is 0.0133% of all the payments, and then the total value is only 0.2%. So these are pretty low error rates when you think about disputes. And again, not all disputes are errors. I remember one hospital last year was saying how she tried it in 2015. 2014, she said she tried it for 2014 data. In 2015, said she tried to delete. She basically disputed everything that went to her hospital. So this may have some. There may be some people who would just have this and that she gave up because of fatigue. So so this may just have this may even be lower. The actual disputes may even be lower than this number. Let's go to the next slide. When we looked at research, it also was pretty low. I mean, 0.5% of the payments, 0.2% of the value. So these are pretty low. If you think about it, these are pretty low amounts. Let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to look a little bit at the media. What did the data release look like? And if you guys have questions, go ahead and start sending them in so we can answer any questions that you have on any of the data. And at the end of the program, we'll try to go through those. So on the 2015 data release, we saw the AC. Basically, everybody just said Novartis was the biggest payer. CMS paid $7.5 billion. Manufacturers paid $7.5 million to physicians. Mostly covered in the. What was interesting is there was no coverage at all in the national media. The release of this year's data was only in the trade press. So I thought that was kind of an interesting note. In MedCity News, Shantanu Agrawal, go to the next slide, please, said that transparency is empowering physicians to be purposeful about their financial relationships with company. There's a notable shift toward charitable contributions and away from interactions such as honorarium gifts. So, CMS is saying things very positively about the data. Go to the next slide. One piece of trade press, California Healthline, showed that California leads in pharmaceutical payments for physicians, but then when you pull up when you actually pull up the demographics of the state, it's just kind of these numbers just kind of follow what the demographics are by population. So you can see that kind of California just has more, I think, more payments because of I think really two things. One is because of population, and two because of the biotech industry there. I think there's a lot of competition for talent among the startups in the California area, and So therefore, people are spending a little bit more money on physicians there. The cost for physicians, also the cost of living there can be pretty outrageous depending on where you live. Go to the next slide. New Jersey had an article where they created a heat map. So if you ever want to go on New Jersey Spotlight, you can actually do a heat map and pull up, press on any kind of area and pull up the neurological surgeon in the area. They got $396,000 from Du Bois for a royalty payment. So, you can basically pull up all the top doctors or where the doctors are in the area. I'm not sure the usefulness of this. I think just some tech guy at a publication thought this would be, here's some data, it'd be kind of cool to use it. One of the things I think that drew away from national media from the release of the data this year, go to the next slide, was the release of the ProPublica hospital report on the Monday before the publication. So they basically, what ProPublica did is they tied the payments to hospitals, the payments to medical centers and doctors in hospitals to the open payments report. So they basically figured out which doctors were affiliated with hospitals, and then they kind of match it up to create their own little hospital report. And that was for the 2014 data. And it said in 2014, about 77% of doctors at this tiny Bay State hospital received payments, mostly in the form of meals. Basically, I guess they haven't banned physicians from coming in, and most meals were under 25 and were given while the company representative provided it. So it's not like there's anything really going on there. It's just gives them something to write about. If you go to the next slide, you can see that they've also created a heat map of what percentage of doctors in your state take drug and device payments. And so you can kind of see that the South is more industry friendly, the Midwest somewhat, and then the Northeast, Maine and Washington State take the least amount. Minnesota taking the least amount, actually, of physicians that work with, and that you probably can use the same heat map for rep access. Probably follows along the same lines. Next slide, please. They did say in the Boston Globe, I guess they needed to fill a little space. They filled up in their newspaper that day. So they said that how the dollars for doctor database was compiled. They used the open payment systems, and they used the general payments file. So they were just going through the open payment system. Next slide. Now this is a very interesting publication that came out right around the time of publication and just after publication in August. It was Association between Physicians from Manufacturers and Publishers and Regional Prescribing Cross-Sectional Study. It basically looked at physicians in two therapeutic areas: diabetes and AFib, and the new AFib drugs, and the new novel anticoagulants. And they saw those physicians who received payments wrote more scripts in that area. What's interesting to note about this study is that Shantanu Agrawal, the Deputy Administrator of CMS, was one of the authors of this paper, along with Harlan Krumwalt and William Fleischman. So it's kind of an interesting mix of people. Joseph Ross, who is I've been on a bunch of lawsuits and things of this nature. So it's kind of an interesting mix of folks that are writers on this. And as a cross-sectional ecological study, we cannot. What's interesting, though, is the finding says, as a cross-sectional ecological study, we cannot prove causation between payments and physicians in increasing prescribing. Further, our findings should be interpreted only as regional level, and our study is limited in prescribing physicians in two drug classes. So go to the next slide. So now that you know that basically the findings were inconsequential, this was in U.S. News and World, and this was in RevCycle Intelligence and some other publications. But I thought this quote was very interesting. Our findings support now they said in one section that they haven't proven anything, and there's no causation. And then this is what the author said to at least one publication: our findings support long-voiced concerns about potential influence of even small payments to physicians by pharmaceutical companies such as food and beverage. The authors wrote, this influence on prescribing can potentially and can potentially negatively affect patients through inappropriate prescribing, or more likely prescribing of more expensive branded drugs when cheaper generic alternatives exist. So the findings didn't show that, but it didn't stop the authors from saying it did anyway. So let's go to the next slide. One of the things that I think you're going to see, and I'm going to take you through a series of JAMA has a bunch of side publications besides JAMA Oncology, Internal Medicine, Ophthalmology, Dermatology, and the past few months, the past 3 or 4 months, you can see that they started to publish reports based on the open payments data. The first one is this one's Financial Relationships with Industry Among National Comprehensive Cancer Care Guideline authors looked at the relationship between industry and the NCCN guidelines and saw that a fair number of them had received have relationships of one type or another, either research or consulting. And then another one was in JAMA Internal Medicine, Pharmaceutical Industry Sponsored Meals and Prescribing Patterns for Medicare Beneficiaries, where they showed that meals can influence Medicare beneficiaries, but it's not really doesn't show that. And we'll keep going down. Go to the next slide. JAMA Ophthalmology ran one, the representation of women with industry ties. It showed that only 17% of the, or 19% of the ophthalmologists who received payments from industry were women. So this kind of tells you guys, tell your folks back in the office that they need to start hiring more women. At least that's what the big complaint was. Physician industry interactions with antivascular endothelial growth factor among U.S. ophthalmologists, looking at the relationship between writing the anti-VEGF drugs, Lucentis and Eylea, and their relationship with receiving payments. And what was interesting on that one is they found that physicians either received payments from one company or another, but not a lot of them received payments from both. So go to the next slide. This final one, the JAMA Dermatology, was exploring industry dermatology financial relationships insights in the open payment data. And what's interesting about all these studies is they all have the same conclusion, and that is the impact on patient care and physician practices and patient perception of physicians is unclear. And then another one, and they basically all have the same thing where they say you cannot make judgments based on this data, but yet they, in the press and the media that follows these they always they go right away to judgment. So it's sort of a cause and effect kind of a thing. Anyway, go to the next slide. We're also going to go through briefly about prosecutions, some of the prosecutions and arrest settlements that have happened in the this last year. Next slide. For anybody who's paying attention, the Oregon Department of Justice, for instance, last year settled a case with Insys Pharmaceuticals on essentially kickbacks for prescriptions for $6.1 million. Doesn't sound like a huge settlement. Go to the next slide. Some of the media has picked up on putting out the pictures of physicians who received high payments from Insys, and also an amount they wrote in prescriptions for Insys drugs. As you can see, it's where they got Medicare payments, $6.4 million, payments from Insys of $54,000, and in 2014 and 2018. Go to the next slide. Apparently, they found one of the doctors. They found must have been a mugshot file photo, and they were able to put that up about the doctor who Insys was supporting. Kind of a reminder to make sure that whoever you're hiring, you might want to check their criminal records before you hire them. And then go to the next slide, and we've seen we've seen now 3 of the Insys salesmen or sales managers arrested. Basically, what Insys was doing was allowing their sales reps to host events without having with sign-in sheet and faking sign-in sheets or having sign-in sheets where there was no education that was provided. And I think the moral to that story is you have to make sure those reps know if they're going to do a meeting at a restaurant, and they need that there has to be some educational component to it, unless it's and especially for your salesmen, it has to be an educational component. So And that's really where they ran into trouble. Go to the next slide. And I think we're not done with incest. I think we're going to hear more and more about that in the coming months. We also have a settlement from BMS, an Insurance Fraud Prevention Act. This is from pre-2007 activity, so this is not information that deals with us right now, but in their media notes, the California Commissioner included links to Doctors for Dollars, online information about money received by doctors. So even though this is old, again, pre-2007 activities, almost 9 years ago at this point, there's still that, they put the link in there for the Dollars for Doctors or the open, which utilizes the open payments data. Go to the next slide. There's also a settlement which was Pfizer settled for an opioid settlement. And what's interesting about that, go to the next slide, is that in Chicago settlement with Pfizer, they said under Physician Payment Sunshine Act passed in Section 2004, pharmaceutical companies, they referenced to the open payments and to ProPublica. In the next slide. In addition, the Chicago complaints that speaker bureaus were amongst the most prolific prescribers of opioids. Prescribers received $36,000 in payments from 2011 to 2013. His prescriptions resulted in $8,000 in payments from the city between those dates. So it's not like they're trying to. I mean, I'm not sure where they're coming, but basically they're trying to say, if you see money in speaking fees and you have claims, then you can, it can come back to bite you. And I'm not sure how many other cities, seeing that Chicago was able to get money out of Pfizer, I think other companies will come in with lawsuits as well, just because they can do it. In the Chicago agreement, it was pretty benign. It was basically reinforcing what Pfizer already does, but that they would just have to disclose additional risks of addiction to opioids even when used as directed. Disclose there's no adequate, well-controlled studies. Basically, a whole bunch of restrictions on promotion, not to promote opioids for any off-label or approved uses, which is, they should be doing that anyway. Include information on opioid addiction, and maintain and promote a non-marketing website on opioids. So I guess they're going to have to put in a website in addition to the payment that they had to give the city. Go to the next slide, please. There are some changes to the next slide after that, please. So what's next? I think there's some changes to the controversial open, this was in model healthcare, changes to controversial open payments policy in the works. Go to the next slide. The 2016, next slide. The 2016 fee schedule, and next slide so far. 2016 fee schedule, CMS asked those open payment questions. And you should note that CMS staff is going through these questions that they received in September 6th, and there may actually be some changes to the open payment system before this administration leaves. It'll be in the fee schedule, even though they didn't put that deadline on themselves. I do believe that they're going to make some changes, and they looked at the nature of payment, how many years do we need to keep this data, what's the year, what about yearly registration, which has been a real cause for concern for people, because every year they change the registration, and then you have to go and redo the whole thing over again. Considering adding reporting reasons for not reporting payments. I have no idea how that would work. Okay, so we didn't report payments this year because I don't know where you would put that. Pre-vetting, requirement based on threshold or sample, i.e. what's a pre-vetted requirement. Regular updates of data, staff changes, ownership, PODs, and streamlining. They're trying to streamline the data. They're trying to say, how can we make this data useful? How can we make this so it's not, there's no onerousness to this? So I think in some respects, CMS is really looking at this program and saying, how do we make this, how do we make it better for the not just for the manufacturers, but for the end users, so that in the end there'll be some, it'll be a better program. Let's go to the next slide, which I thought was quite a thoughtful thing for them to do. So CMS recently clarified their position on on CME on an FAQ. Said basically if an applicable manufacturer or group purchasing organization provides a payment or transfer of value to continuing education provider to support a continuation program but did not require, instruct, direct, or otherwise cause, including but not limiting, encouraging, or suggesting the continuing education provider to provide payments or transfers to a specific particular physician speaker or faculty, would this contribution be considered reportable? And the answer was no. And they go on and explain that basically as long as you're not instructing them on you're not or hint here, give it to this doctor, that these payments aren't to be reported. In addition, and then they also said that you don't have to that even if you know the name of the person, you still don't have to report it as long as you didn't specify that specific physician. Go to the next slide. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. And then the next slide after that. And anybody who wants the slides, my email's at the end. I'll be glad to send these over to you. Also, this year, government is a platform for progress. HHS's Open Government Plan talked about promoting the Open Payments Initiative, which publishes data on the financial relationships between healthcare providers and industry and healthcare providers. So basically, they're going to be promoting more of the open payments. I think trying to fix it, trying to make it better. There is a bill going through Congress that passed the House. There is actually a good possibility that this will be passed during the lame duck session. I think basically Congress will get everything off their plate in one foul swoop. The president opened to this, and who knows if this will make it in there or not. But the 21st Century Cures still has a life, albeit a medium one. So we should be able to see something happen with that soon. Go to the next slide. I'm sorry, and go to the next slide. So in summary, though the aggregate spend data remain the same, there's huge variations in company level data and intercompany level data. There's not much media on just open payments, but look for more reports. I think you need to think that all these journal articles are being written for a purpose, probably to suggest some changes to open payments or some changes to payments to physicians in general. Look at your data. You want to document your outliers. There's more plaintiff attorneys will be using this open payments. Grandma is not necessarily using this to look up her doctor. I've never run into a doctor who's had any patient ever tell them that they've had this, but others won't. Look for changes in open payments in the 2017 fee schedule, which should come out at the end of this month. So, so far, if you want to have me back to go through those, I'll be glad to do that. And then a bill may yet be passed on reprints and CME, and global ag spend. There's a global ag spend movement, and it's going to be huge. And Safar is going to talk a little bit about the European data. So, Safar?
Thank you very much, Tom. So before I go to my slides, I would like to just remind everyone that if you have any questions, there is a question or a chat box on the right-hand side below. Feel free to ask any questions if you have any to Tom or myself. So you just heard Tom speak in detail about the US payment data, and granted that it's been out for 3 years now. I want to show you some case studies, some insights for FPA data that just came out this summer, and I will present only one scenario to whet your appetite for a comprehensive webinar for FPA data that's scheduled later for this month. So I've listed the scenario to 4 countries for ease of understanding and for ease of showing broad patterns. If you look at 4 countries, Germany has the highest spend, which is 576 million euro, followed by Italy, Spain, and UK. If you narrow it down by donation and grants, UK has the highest spend at 25 million, and Germany has the lowest spend. One could say that higher spending are also the least charitable. So if you narrow it down by physician fees, we see Spain has the highest at 297 million, and UK has the lowest at 34 million. And
Then lastly, if you narrow it down by registration fees, you can see that Italy has the largest spend at 25 million and UK has the lowest at 3 million. There is many more details in FPA number, and then Mumtaz, who is the expert in dealing with FPA, will speak in a broader presentation of FPA analytics in a webinar that's going to happen in a couple of weeks from now. So I have it right on the slides. You can see the name of the webinar is Making the FPA Physician Spend Number Talk. Ned will be presenting and speaking to this topic in more detail. So I would like to invite everyone to come and join us in that webinar. You can see in the slide that it's happening on the 27th of October at 11 a.m. CST. If you have any questions on how to join the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. I have some questions that just came in. So I would like to, the first question is from Mark. He's saying that his question is, are you seeing any noticeable changes in spending patterns since the start of transparency disclosure in 2013 in the US?
I'm sorry, have I seen any, I'm sorry,
so the question
I was
is,
listening, but I couldn't.
Yeah, let me repeat the question. The question is, are you seeing any noticeable changes in spending patterns since the start of transparency disclosure in 2013?
Not, I mean, yes and no. I think you're seeing company, it's not really, it's, again, at the beginning, it's more on a company level of the spending patterns. So it's not all in one place. I mean, it's really moving, again, company by company level as far as the spending patterns go. And I think it's therapeutic area by therapeutic area. And but no, I don't think you've seen, you know, as far as the gross numbers, no. Underneath, if you look at individual companies, yes, you do. If you want, I can give you more detail. If I have had more specifics on what the question was, you know, like if we're looking at a specific area, we give you more detail. Go ahead. Let's get to the next one.
Okay, so the next question is that just came in. We have questions coming in actually, and we still have I think 2 more minutes to go, so I think we can cover all of them. The next question is: are regulators using open payments data for conducting investigation? Do we know?
Yes, we do, because you can see that they are in the case of. You can see it in the cases that we went through in the city of Chicago, in the state of Oregon, in the state of California. These prosecutors are using everything at their advantage, you know, to review. And I have talked to several U.S. attorneys who, when people are bringing them cases now, are bringing examples of open payments. Incest, without open payments, I don't think incest. Well, I mean, they could have solved that case, but open payments, I think, gave easier access to the plaintiffs to show that on the specific amounts of payments that were going on, and that's through the federal prosecutors. So I think you are, and I think you will be seeing more and more of this data used.
Okay, thank you. I have actually 2 questions. They're basically the same. Carissa and Philip, they're asking if they will receive the presentation after the webinar. I will answer that. Yes, we will send you the presentation slides, and also we're recording this webinar. Both of them will be available on our website, and we will also email them to you. Just give us 24 hours to put them all together. Next question for you, Tom, is what type of regulations do you foresee in the future as follow-ups to the current transparency wave that is going across the globe?
So if anybody's noticed, pricing seems to be a big issue right now, and I can see that regulations around price negotiations. For instance, I was just in California, and there's a bus that says, you know, say yes to lower drug prices, and it was sitting in a parking lot across from a pharmaceutical company. if you can imagine. And it's a state initiative which ties to reference pricing in California. I think as they're trying to beat up pharmaceutical companies to get price negotiations, they will use whatever tools are in their disposal. And part of that will be, you guys are paying all this money to physicians. Why don't you do that? If you look at Hillary Clinton's page about restricting DTC advertising because of the spending that's going on, anything that there's that there's a view about spending, I don't think you'll see more restrictions on physician-industry interaction, but I think they'll use it as a tool for other legislation and other regulations. Are you there? Did we lose you?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was on mute.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom. The last question is from one of the attendees. He's asking, how are the physicians? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So the question is, how are the physicians responding to the open payments data available? Has anything changed for them?
Well, I would say that initially there was a lot of apprehension about the open payments data, and there was a lot of concern that the open payments, that this open payments data would garnish their reputations. And I think if you saw the initial stories, it did garnish a lot of people's reputations. I think there were stories about specific physicians, especially in the small market stories that were written. So I think there was a lot of hesitation. I mean, I had one author, for instance, tell me, come out to me and say, I'm not putting my name on something because they're attributing all this writing support to my name. And so there's, I think there's kind of it didn't help in industry physician relationships, but I think as more and more because there is so much data in here that it's like finding a needle in a haystack. I think less and less. There's so much data. There's so many transactions that I think now physicians feel a lot more comfortable about working with industry. But still, some of them have restrictions. They're not allowed to. Their institutes have put restrictions on them. They're not allowed to work with industry on helping to consult or talk about a drug that maybe is really helping patients. So I think open payments has made people more conscious of the rules of their institutions.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. I have more questions coming in.
Well, I think we have another couple minutes.
Yeah, we have enough.
It's only 12:53.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them because we still have a few more minutes to go. So the next question, Tom, is there any evidence that physicians are influenced by the payment made by the industry, bearing the few known cases that have been publicized?
Well, I think the big data studies that I showed, for instance, from the New England Journal of Medicine and I'm not New England Journal of Medicine, but from JAMA and from BMJ, I think those kind of big data studies, they show that physicians that spend more time with industry receive more money. But is it because they're spending more time with industry, spending more time working on products that they receive more money, or that they're, there's not really ever been a cause and effect shown to this, except for in the Ketam cases where, in incest, for instance, clearly it had an influence. Clearly, in the incest case, clearly the money had an influence because they weren't providing any scientific content. So it's like if you don't provide scientific content, you're not providing some kind of education to the physician about your products, and you're just doing it for the sake of having a party, then yes, I think that could be considered an influence. But if it's a truly, if you're truly just educating a physician and he learns more about it through that, and he writes more product, and he writes more of the drug because he sees that it's effective, it's safe, it helps his patients, I think I think it's a reasonable win-win for everybody.
Thank you, Tom. I don't have any more questions. I do want to remind everyone that if you are interested in FPI data, we have a webinar with Ned on the 27th of October at 11 a.m. CST. Feel free to join and let me know if you want any help on how to join. Also, Tom and I are going to be at the PCF Pharma Congress Compliance Conference that's happening next week on the 19th. So if you're going to be around at the conference, you can approach any of us if you have any questions.
I'd also just like to say one thing, and that is I encourage you, if you're not already a subscriber, to Life Science Compliance Update to get more information about what the kind of latest on compliance issues are, or also to Policy and Medicine to get updates. But I encourage you to read our publications, become engaged in the community, and let's look very closely, and we'll have some updates on our website when the fee schedule comes out in 2 weeks to let you guys know what changes they made to open payments.
Right.
Thank you very much for having me so far.
Thank you very much, Tom. It was very nice to have you speak through your presentation. I have a slide in front of me that has your information. So if anyone has any question, you can reach out to Tom. His email address, phone, and company websites are on the slide. If there are no other questions, so with that, I would like to conclude this webinar. It was really nice having everyone be at this webinar, and we really thank you for this. That should be it. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you. Goodbye.